to after.
All right. We're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot
That's
to
true.
cover
That's
for
true.
today. So welcome everyone to Community Conversations, Turning the Page. This is our monthly discussion of books about systemic racism and its impact on health, healthcare, biomedical research, and health inequities in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Just to revisit our purposes, Dr. Bridges and I put this together. Really, Dr. Bridges started it. I'm a latecomer to this. And the purpose is really to understand our history and the social patterns and systems that shape health. Also, to give us practice talking about racism and racial inequities, then to provide an opportunity for personal learning and growth to create a shift within individuals, and then to provoke an emotional state, whether that be discomfort, empathy, outrage, all of the above, that raises our consciousness and awareness and commits us to actions and systems change. We are very excited to be discussing the book Inflamed, Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice by Rupa Maria and Raj Patel. This is a great way to follow up our previous book by Jeff Goodell, The Heat Will Kill You First, which really focused on the environmental injustices of climate change and really how heat was really transforming our lives. And so this book, Inflamed, we really felt would be the perfect follow-up. It was actually lower down on our list, but given just how pivotal this book is, we wanted to raise it up a little higher and start on it a little sooner. A little bit about the authors. Rupa Maria describes herself as a believer in the capacity of kindness and music to unify us. She is an internal medicine hospitalist specializing in the care of seriously ill at the University of California, San Francisco. And she's also director of the Do No Harm Coalition, which is a group of more than 450 UCSF health workers and students dedicated to ending racism and state violence. This is not to be confused with the Do No Harm conservative coalition that is trying to end all teaching about racism and its impact as a structural and social determinant of health in schools of medicine across the country. She is also working with Lakota and Dakota tribes to create a space for the practice of decolonized medicine at the Minnewacomic Clinic and Farm at Standing Rock. She is a co-investigator on the Justice Study, a national research effort to understand the link between police violence and health outcomes in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And finally, but not least, she's also a composer and front woman for Rupa and the April Fishes, which is a project that uses music to explore the intersection of society and disease. And after all of reading all of this about her, I developed my own academic crush on her. This is her with her band. She is a guitarist, both electric and acoustic guitar, and the music is pretty good. So I also recommend you trying to check out some videos. And then her co-author is Raj Patel, who's a research professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. He is an academic, journalist, activist, and writer who has his PhD in development sociology from Cornell and was recently a fellow at Food First, which is the Institute of Food and Development Policy, a research associate at the School of Development Studies at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and author of the 2008 book, Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System. So these two coming together, sort of like the Wonder Twin powers of the old Super Friends cartoons that some of us might remember who aren't old like me. The authors start off with quotes by Aimé Césaire and Michel Foucault, and that right away lets you know that this is going to be grounded in some serious philosophy as well as anti-colonial and decolonization theory. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Aimé Césaire, he was a poet. He lived between 1913 and 2008. He was a cultural theorist and politician who played a central role in the negritude movement of the 20th century and anti-colonial struggles and debates about Black and cultural identity. And one of my favorite quotes from Césaire is from his poem, Poetry and Knowledge, where he says, and I quote here, "Poetic knowledge is born in the silence of scientific knowledge. Science offers us a perspective on the world, but a summary and superficial kind. All in all, scientific knowledge counts, measures, classifies, and kills. But it is not enough to say that scientific knowledge is summary. We must add that it is impoverished and half-starved. To acquire it, we have sacrificed everything: desires, fears, feelings, psychological complexes. To acquire this impersonal knowledge, that is scientific knowledge, we have depersonalized the self. An impoverished knowledge, I say, because at its origin, whatever may be its riches besides, stands an impoverished humanity." And so by grounding us first and foremost in quotes from Aimé Césaire, it is letting you know that this is going to be a text grounded in decolonization theory. So what they want us to be able to understand, right, is how chronic inflammation plays such a major role in our lives in these various different ways. And to do so, this text is bringing together theory from decolonization theory, from history, but precisely guerrilla history, from ecology, and from dynamics of power. And I hear you already asking me, Jason, what the heck is guerrilla history? Guerrilla history is history from the perspective of the people who Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth. It is the history of the poor, the powerless, and the formerly colonized. And in terms of Michel Foucault's, I have there pictured his text, Power Knowledge, right? Michel Foucault, as he defines, says there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. And this is really about how systems of knowledge and systems of power go hand in hand. And all of these discourses are coming together in this text. And all of that, they claim, is what's necessary to get us at a point where we can start making diagnoses and practicing deep medicine. What the heck is deep medicine? Deep medicine is the understanding that our bodies have evolved in systems of deep relationships with the sun, soil, water, tides, seasons, bacteria, viruses, animals, plants, and fungi, as well as with systems of power, knowledge, and social relations. And these systems interact to create health and illness. And so, as I said, right, that this text is about decolonizing health. And in their own words, quote, "Most doctors and most humans really have unwittingly inherited a colonial worldview that emphasizes individual health, disconnecting illness from its social and historical context, and obscuring our place in the web of life that makes us who we are." And they do so through an analysis of inflammation as both an experience taking place within our bodies and experience taking place within the ecology, and as both literal and metaphor for thinking about health and illness. So we have this quick 3.5 minute video on the processes of inflammation. To many of you in the biomedical sciences, maybe this will be like a little recap of stuff that you haven't like really studied since graduate school. For historians like myself, not trained in the biomedical sciences, I found this really helpful.
Inflammation is the body's protective response against infections or injuries. Inflammation mobilizes defensive cells to the site of injury, limits the spread of pathogens, eliminates them, and initiates tissue repair. Inflammation can occur in any organ, but is most common and also most easily observable in the skin and underlying tissues. Typical signs include redness, heat, swelling, and pain. Inflammation is an important defense mechanism, but it can be a double-edged sword when things go wrong. An autoimmune disease may result when inflammation targets and destroys the body's own cells. An acute inflammation that fails to stop after the original insult is cleared can become chronic and damaging to healthy tissues. Acute inflammation is initiated when tissue-resident immune cells, such as macrophages, encounter an inflammatory stimulus. This stimulus can be a pathogen, a toxin, or an injured host cell. Binding of the stimulus to its receptor on the immune cell triggers a signaling cascade that activates production of cytokines and other inflammatory mediators. Inflammatory chemicals dilate blood vessels, increasing blood flow and enhancing vessel permeability, allowing plasma fluid and more immune cells to seep through and accumulate in the inflamed tissue. This vasodilation is responsible for clinical signs of inflammation such as redness, heat, and swelling. The infiltration of blood components into the injured tissue occurs in 3 phases. The first phase is the exudation of plasma fluid containing various antimicrobial mediators, platelets, and blood clotting factors. These factors can destroy microbes and stop any bleeding that may have occurred. The second phase is the infiltration of neutrophils, the major phagocytes involved in first-line defense. Once activated by inflammatory mediators, endothelial cells of blood vessels become adhesive. They attach to neutrophils in blood flow, slowing them down before getting them to squeeze through the vessel wall. Chemical cues guide neutrophils to the battlefield, where they engulf bacteria and destroy them with enzymes or toxic peroxides. Neutrophils may also release highly reactive oxygen species in a phenomenon known as oxidative burst, which kills pathogens faster and more efficiently. The pathogen-laden neutrophils then die via apoptosis. In the third phase arrive monocytes. Monocytes differentiate into macrophages, which then remove pathogens, injured cells, and dying neutrophils by phagocytosis. Macrophages that have completed their mission are cleared from the tissue by the lymphatic system. Accumulation of fluid increases pressure on lymphatic capillaries, forcing open their one-way valves, facilitating lymphatic drainage. Lymph-containing debris-laden macrophages passes through a number of lymph nodes and is filtered clean before it returns to the bloodstream. Once the site is cleared from the original insult, immune cells stop producing pro-inflammatory chemicals and instead start producing anti-inflammatory mediators, which actively drive the termination of inflammation. Many of these anti-inflammatory molecules are lipids, some of which are synthesized from dietary omega-3 fatty acids. This step is essential in ensuring the favorable outcome of inflammation. Failure to resolve inflammation leads to development of chronic inflammation, which continuously deals damage to healthy tissues. Chronic inflammation is a known contributing factor to pathogenesis of a wide variety of conditions, including cardiovascular diseases, asthma, diabetes, arthritis, and even cancer.
All right. So as the authors point out, most chronic diseases are linked to inflammation, and these include neurological diseases and disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, encephalitis, also illnesses in the lungs, pulmonary fibrosis, acute lung injury, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, asthma, then down in the liver system, hepatic fibrosis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as well as in the skin, atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, discoid lupus, and I'm not going to pronounce that one as well. The eyes, heart, kidney, intestines, bone. All of these are sites where the chronic disease is linked to inflammation. And how does inflammation contribute to disease? Shifts in the inflammatory response from short to long-lived are what cause a breakdown of immune tolerance and then lead to major alterations in all tissues, organs, and normal cellular physiology. What are some of the root causes of chronic inflammation? They are many-fold. They include dietary causes, right? Gluten, casein, processed foods, sugar and carbohydrates, industrially produced food, fast foods, and so forth. Also, lived experiences, such as acute poverty, police violence, discrimination, forced displacement, disproportionate exposure to toxins. And the more that those lived experiences accumulate and become regular lived experiences and not one-off, the worse the inflammation becomes. Along those lines, stress, right, which leads to an increase in cortisol, adrenaline, non-adrenaline, dopamine, etc. And finally, some of the pharmaceutical products that we consume, including corticosteroids, antibiotics, and antacids. They begin the text sort of looking at COVID as a illness that uniquely targeted people who already had systemic inflammation ongoing. And these were persons who were in the United States, right, who also suffered from the lived experiences of racism. And depending on the degree of the lived experience of racism that they suffered, in addition to things like poverty and other issues, really exacerbated their inflammation and made them ripe for severe COVID-19 illnesses. Black, Indigenous, and people of color were overrepresented, their bodies subject to inflammation of all kinds long before COVID-19 virus ever settled into their lungs. And the systemic social and economic disenfranchisement rendered their bodies most susceptible to COVID when it hit. And here in this chart, we can see how that there were higher excess deaths during the pandemic in the US, and those were partly driven by racial inequities. And when we further break that down into intersectionality, right, that we can here see how not only were groups impacted by colonialism more intensely, did they have a profound expression of inflammatory disease, but you also see how that's impacted by socioeconomic status as well. So within each racial or ethnic group, if you were also having socioeconomic challenges, that increased your chronic inflammation and made you more susceptible to COVID infections. As an exploratory or as explanatory model for the deep medicine that they're speaking of, the introduction focuses on this community pictured here, Rogue Valley, Oregon. It is nestled between the Cascades and the Siskiyou Mountains, split by the Rogue River watershed that makes it so fertile. These are the ancestral homelands of the Takelma Native American people, but currently the valley is known for its pear orchards, vineyards, and enormous herb production, industrial herb production. This is where it is situated, on the very southern border of Oregon, not far from the Pacific coast, and also just miles away from the Northern California border. And these are the housing units pictured there, are Rogue Valley Country Estates. And I always, there's always that irony in how trailer parks are named, right? It is one of the many trailer park communities that house the migrant families that harvest food in the valley. These units are tiny, and the Latino families that live there are often have 2 to 3 families in each home. These were the fires that devastated the region in 2018, 2019, but none as bad as in the summer of 2020. And that's what's pictured here. When over 3,000 structures in the area burned, 75% of those were mobile homes, housing the migrant farm worker communities. And as many of you will recall from our last book, Jeff Goodell's The Heat Will Kill You First, wildfires are becoming more frequent and more intense with the heating of the planet due to climate change. And this region in Southern Oregon and Northern California were not at risk for wildfire devastation 30 years ago. But now, intense, huge, and out of control fires are an annual event. And the ones in 2020 were particularly devastating to the farm worker community there. Here, pictured is the family of Gladys Garcia on the right, and her children, Isaac, 14, Caleb, 9, and Anna Alvarez, 19. And they stand at the site of their burned home in this area of Rogue Creek. Most of the Latino and Latina community migrated to the valley after being pushed out of their home countries by US-led neoliberal economic policies and political instability and or climate catastrophe. Those living in this area didn't trust FEMA because it was part of Homeland Security. So many didn't actually apply for assistance in the aftermath of the fires. The fires delayed the harvest and polluted the air, and many found themselves harvesting crops in this area without shoes, socks, or masks of any kind. Nevertheless, N95 respirators to stop them not only from inhaling the toxic smoke in the air, but also to protect them from contamination from COVID. And all the while, they were constantly subjected to ice raids. And this left them in a position of extreme precarity. And therefore, the toxic air caused inflammation in their lungs and blood vessels, rendered them extra vulnerable to a COVID outbreak. And when a COVID outbreak did strike that region, migrant farm workers were 5 times more likely to die from their COVID infection than were anyone else that lived in that region. So as the authors explained, right, to really have an accurate diagnosis, you can't limit the diagnosis to just COVID-19. An accurate diagnosis of COVID in the Rogue Valley must involve a complete history of the arrangements of power that led to certain lives being considered expendable, sacrificed to profits from pear trees planted on land acquired through colonial violence and theft. Put a different way, an accurate diagnosis would complicate the systems, or would implicate, the systems of injustice created during the colonial era, beginning with the exploitation and enslavement of the Takelma people and ending with a system of racial capitalism that treats migrant workers as disposable. A history that fails to incorporate this history is one that can have no part in healing. And so this diagram is actually a diagram that Rupa Maria put together. And as she explains, in this book, we locate the causal origin of disease in the multidimensional spaces around and beyond the individual, in histories, ecologies, narratives, and dynamics of power, starting with and grounded in our history of colonialism that has brought the current world system into being. Not just the current world system in terms of how we all find ourselves living in the Americas, but also the system of food production, the system of global trade, and labor migration and exploitative labor practices that all go along with the colonial project, right? And as you can see there, try to map out how the different directions of power have influenced the lives we live and all lead to trauma and inflammation, right? All roads here lead to trauma and inflammation. Most important to note is that colonialism is far from over. There are over 70 countries with indigenous peoples whose lives are under threat by colonial expansion today. And as quiet as it's kept, many of the migrant farm workers in the United States actually come from indigenous communities. The Latin America is a mix of indigenous, Spanish, African, Jewish, a little bit of Asian heritage, all mixed in. However, the persons who most usually find themselves as migrant farm workers are persons who have the largest and highest percentage of indigenous heritage within them. Those are the categories that are most vulnerable, most at risk, and live the lives that are most precarious and forced into migrant farm labor. For instance, in Cameroon, indigenous Baka communities have an average lifespan of 35 years. The indigenous Nanette women in Russia are 6 times more likely to die in childbirth than national average. Aboriginal infants in Australia are twice as likely to die as the infants of white settlers. And on Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the lifespan of the Lakota is 15 years less than the neighboring white settlers there. And it is not only that these chronic inflammation are impacting people of color, right? There's collateral damage for all of us. Colonialism isn't simply the physical occupation of land. As the authors state, it is an operation of power in which one cosmology is extinguished and replaced with another. One set of interpretations about humans' place in the universe is supplanted. Patterns of identity, language, culture, work, relationship, territory, time, community, and care are transformed. And in this way, colonialism fundamentally alters our relationships with the web of life, and we are all living with its consequences. So I'm going to now turn things over to Dr. Bridges, who is going to go through chapter 1. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. So this book, they now begin to go through every system in the body and talk about these concepts and kind of highlight each system. And so it's all about inflammation. So suiting, they start with the immune system. So inflammation, the body's ancient and powerful mechanism to heal itself, as we learned about, is a product of the immune system. The innate immune system is a first responder branch that reacts to the signal of damage or infection. It is responsible for inflammation and phagocytosis, and it's a key player in wound healing. The adaptive immune system retains recognition of prior exposures through an individual's lifetime through antibodies and memory cells. But the innate immune system also has developed ways of recognition through ancient molecular patterns, which are pathogen-associated molecular patterns. Can you go back to the first?
Oh, sorry, I touched you.
No, I'll let you know. And damage-associated molecular patterns. And this memory is instilled before birth and transmitted across generations. So in other words, as they put it in the book, the innate immune system serves as a community resource, establishing a transgenerational molecular vocabulary. The adaptive immune system and the innate immune system work together to shape immunity types, which are determined by the interplay between cytokines and other cellular signals from the innate immune system. All right, next slide. So as you can see, and we all watched that reminder video of inflammation and the processes, but these cytokines, these signaling chemicals that are released by immune cells that really call in like the whole response are so important and can be stimulated from a variety of ways. And as we learned also, next slide, this, when the inflammatory response is chronic, it can lead to systemic inflammatory state, and the body's healing mechanism then is transformed into a smoldering fire, as they put it in the book, that creates ongoing harm. chronic systemic inflammation can speed the aging process, and this relationship between aging and inflammation, they said in the book, is called inflammaging, which I had never heard that term, but now I can't unhear it. This process leads cellular and metabolic damage, and also leads, importantly, to cellular senescence. So cellular senescence is the process by which aging cells permanently stop dividing but remain metabolically active. And some senescent cells go on to express the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, which transforms them into vigorous producers of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So just stimulating this systemic inflammation, further fanning the flame. Next slide. And also, senescent cells contribute to the progression of many diseases. So the immune response to infection can result in, these senescent cells aiding in atherosclerosis, type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's disease, osteoporosis, and osteoarthritis. The immune response to infection or other triggers of inflammation unfolds differently in different groups of people because of how the immune system has been toned over time through lifetimes and ancestries of social oppression. And much of this toning is due to a combination of environmental factors collectively known as the exposome. The exposome of modern life differs drastically from that of indigenous and traditional people who maintain critical relationships with the living systems upon which their lives depend. While systemic inflammation and its accompanying diseases have increased dramatically across industrialized societies, they remain rare in traditional ones. The exposome of many Black Americans is microbially denuded and contains numerous systemic triggers of chronic inflammation, which pushes the body out of homeostasis. Network medicine views the cell as a multi-layer network with three principal interdependent layers: the regulatory network, which is all interactions affecting RNA and protein expression; the protein interaction network, responsible for the formation of protein complexes and signaling; and the metabolic network, which represents all metabolic reactions, including those derived from the microbiome. The exposome-related factors can affect each layer of this multi-layer network in positive or negative ways. For example, the polyphenol EGCG, a biochemical compound in green tea with potential therapeutic effects on type 2 diabetes, is known to bind at least 52 different chemicals. And research has shown that many of these chemicals are proximal to 83 proteins associated with type 2 diabetes, suggesting multiple mechanistic pathways to potentially account for the relationship between green tea consumption and reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. And then on the other hand, trichloroethylene, TCE, is a volatile organic compound that was widely used in industrial settings and now remains as a widespread environmental contaminant present in drinking water, indoor environments, ambient air, groundwater, and soil. Multiple lines of evidence support a link between TCE exposure and kidney cancer and likely non-Hodgkin lymphoma. TCE perturbs at least 2 different layers of the cellular network, covalently binding to proteins from the protein interaction network, altering their function, and affecting the cellular metabolic network. As the authors of this 2020 paper in Science concluded, the exposome is where nature meets nurture and chemistry meets biology. The exposome's impact on immune function can be seen through the risk for development of allergic disease. So the authors point out that children growing up on farms where mostly hand tools and no pesticides are used typically develop protection from allergic disease. However, children growing up in the Salinas Valley, where farm workers are exposed to robust levels of organophosphate pesticides in industrial agriculture, develop an increased risk of allergic disease. So this depends on their exposome. Exposome can be a damaging reality that shortens our telomeres, or the DNA protein structures that form the protective end caps to our chromosomes. Research has shown that chronic stress and childhood and lifetime trauma can lead to premature telomere shortening. And a growing body of research has shown that this stress and trauma-induced shortening can be passed down to subsequent generations. So the authors point to some of the 19th century physicians and pathologists instrumental in our understanding of the immune system, who understood, because of their own historical and social context, the relationship between medicine and health and one's social and historical context. So Rudolf Virchow says, medicine is a social science and politics is nothing more than medicine on a large scale. And every disease has two causes. The first is pathophysiological, the second political. And we know this to be true, that historical racism, so many of you may have watched Dr. Glenn and our community partners talk about redlining last week, or maybe you have learned about redlining, but essentially through years and years of racist practices, areas of cities were literally lined with red, and those were mostly communities of color, and those places could not get access to affordable mortgages, and so have, through the generations, lost intergenerational wealth. And so some researchers recently have been looking at, okay, what do we see today that relates directly to this historic practice of redlining, although, it's not done anymore, but those neighborhoods are still forever changed because of it. And this study that was published in 2022 looked at historical redlining and the association with present day air pollution. And so they found that in many US cities, including Kansas City, they came and did it here. If they took the redlining map and then lined it up with air quality, it followed exactly. So the green neighborhoods were the most wealthy, had the best air quality, and then went on to the redlined neighborhoods having the worst air quality. And so this, of course, is impacting, who's living in these neighborhoods still to this day are mostly people of color. Next slide. We know that Americans of color are harmed by environmental hazards in staggeringly disproportionate numbers. There's more lead poisoning, atmospheric pollution, infectious disease, exposure, industrial waste, and that people of color are more likely to live in so-called sacrifice zones and fence line communities, which are just adjacent to industries and factories that are producing these pollutants. And it's this systemic onslaught of toxic exposure that is cutting lives short and burdening our healthcare system. Another line of evidence linking toxic exposure, environmental exposure, to inflammatory chronic disease is the relationship between diabetes and air pollution. So several studies in the last couple decades have looked at the link between air quality and glucose intolerance. So a mouse model in 2013 found that mice exposed to ozone can develop glucose intolerance, a precursor for diabetes. In 2017, overweight or obese children in Los Angeles were followed for an average of 3 years, and the children who lived in neighborhoods with the highest concentrations of air pollutants experienced greater declines in insulin sensitivity. Also in 2017, researchers from 8 institutions tracked more than 45,000 African-American women across the United States, and those who were exposed to the highest concentrations of ozone were about 20% more likely to develop diabetes, even after adjusting for other possible explanations such as diet and exercise levels. So the authors really call this an exposome of oppression, that the damage that is being done to our bodies is not the result of individual choices, but the mandates of a certain social, economic, political, and environmental ecology in which we live. And we need to see the connections, understand the connections before we can repair them. So with our 20 minutes that we have left, we want to hear what you all are thinking, kind of digest some of this, ask questions. We came up with a few questions to get us thinking What are the sources of inflammation in our lives? How does our current healthcare system alleviate or contribute to inflammation? And what major obstacles do we see to reorganizing the way we live to improve the exposome of all people?
All right. We got that through that faster than
Yeah, we did. Good. Do we want to break into two groups since there are 11 of us?
There are enough of us. I'm gonna post the questions in the chat
Okay.
so everybody will continue to have them.
I wonder if, oh, okay, that was from you. I don't think I can do breakout rooms. Stacy, are you available to put us in two different breakout rooms? Maybe. If not, I guess we can stay together and talk.
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts just coming off of sort of hearing the summary of this book and the first chapter?
Having not read the book, I really, really appreciate the summary that both of you provided. That was super helpful. And my initial thought is that just before joining this meeting, I got lunch from the cafeteria in Cambridge, and there was a big sign saying something about heart healthy choices, and you should exercise more, and you should avoid smoking, and you should choose more leafy vegetables, and like all of these individual suggestions, rather than systemic suggestions. And it is, not wrong necessarily, but just kind of frustrating that what is continually offered by medicine is all of these individual solutions to these larger systemic problems.
Very much so. Very much so.
Yeah. And Dana notes that in contrast, a very long line for Taco Tuesday and a cafeteria full of bad options, right?
And just a reminder for everyone, we will cover this text in 4 parts. So today was really just the introductory chapters and to get us thinking about sources of inflammation in our lives, thinking about overall inflammation and its relationship to health, and really beginning to see, right, like taking a deep medical approach that incorporates how all these historical forces, ecological forces, environmental racism forces all come together to impact us, and to begin thinking about not only our individual food choices a little differently, but how do we organize our society differently in such a way where it's not overly expensive to make these choices, right? That they are easy choices that are readily available to everyone, and that we're not imposing a toxic exposome on so many peoples around the world.
Trina.
Hello. I did not read the book. I just found out about this book club series yesterday, which I'm excited to now be a part of, and I, intend to be on the to participate going forward, and we'll have read the next part. But this is great information, and I think like you said, like tying all the things together, the real impact all this stuff environmentally, what we're eating, what we're inhaling, all these things that, how they're impacting our body. And for me, I feel like I've been unaware so long, for so long, that, now trying to be aware, get educated, and so this is another step in that direction. So I really appreciate the conversation, the information. And I'm thinking, from a perspective like, how can I help, the people that I know to be educated and to, because you think that something should not be harmful to your body, but when you think about it more globally, it really is. And we don't associate, like we might feel a pain or have inflammation, somewhere and we're not tying it to like the food that we're eating or, the chemicals that we're inhaling, the cleaning solutions and all those things. And it's kind of scary when you think about it, but I think being educated is like the right step in a direction of, taking care of our bodies.
Thank you. I definitely agree with that. Yeah, we have to see it. We can't do anything about it till we understand the problem. Dana, do you want to talk about water quality? That's so scary.
Like, yeah, I was just thinking, it's that usual frustration. I'm feeling that usual frustration of like lack of control. Like so many people are being exposed to all of these bad things and they don't have any control over that. They're working in a certain environment or they're living in a certain environment and we still just, I don't know why this isn't just more commonly accepted as a problem. Like there's still this default to individual decision or individual failures or whatever. And I guess I didn't read the book. So thank you for introducing and providing the overview so that I can speak on that and refer it to other people. So I appreciate that. And water's just like, I feel like it's just a natural default. That's one that we hear about probably more commonly, or it's more like widely accepted that there's issues with water. And when they announced on campus this last year that we all needed to go home because of the water quality, and then, it's like, they're like, it may have been happening for an extended period of time. And I'm thinking, is anybody going to like test our bodies to see if there was some kind of an impact? There was no like pre and post, assessment to determine if we were all poisoned in some way. And, I guess it makes me feel grateful that in general, I don't have to worry about that most of the time. And I have the ability we had the ability to go home and work from home and to replace or remove ourselves from the situation while it was being repaired. And so many people are not in a situation where they can move houses or whatever.
Yeah. And the politics of water are even more dire in indigenous communities who've been in a continual struggle to regain water rights that they have often lost as a result of colonialism. And indigenous communities that relied on rivers that have been dammed, that get siphoned off, or that have been polluted, right, by industrialization, they continue to feel this impact even more so.
Thanks, Audra. Yeah, my mind keeps going to the regulatory, around like what chemicals we're allowed to, America uses so many more chemicals than like different European countries. And it's so scary to think, when like, I have two little kids and it's like, be really careful about what kind of products we buy that put on their bodies. And, like we don't quite know what all these things are going to do. But if I had less choice, if I could only buy the cheapest thing, I would have much less control over it. That's really scary.
Trina, did you want to say something else?
Yes, I was going to say, I have a friend she has like she's dealing with a few health issues, and one is cancer. And her doctor, there were some things that her doctor told her to stay away from, like this long list of things. And one of them was Gatorade because of the dye in the Gatorade. And I was thinking, anybody who's an athlete, and you don't even have to be an athlete, but like we have been told that Gatorade is, good for for hydration and all these other things, but I don't remember seeing anywhere on the label that, it has chemicals that could potentially harm you. And it's just so disheartening. I feel like you can't trust any of these companies.
Mhm.
and that the regulatory units are not really, they're not set up to protect us. And maybe they were at one time or another, but because money usually rules everything, if they're getting money from supporters or these, lobbyists or whoever, then, our protection, dwindles a little more and more as they're financially supported.
You are right on track with that. I used to work at another institution that specialized in food safety and science, and I'm going to just say it's scary. We all need to be very, very wary of the marketing and the labeling and all of that. I mean, it's definitely something to be concerned about.
I watched a talk and learned a new term called the commercial determinants of health, which I hadn't really heard before, but it's all about this, where it's like these big corporations, like specifically like fast food and soda and all, these companies, but also I'm sure it would fall into it like companies being able to use whatever cheap chemicals they want to because they have so much power in our society and how that's impacting health. But how do we, yeah, there's such an, powerful force. Even if we know we shouldn't have dyes. Did you all know? Okay, this is how I get about food dyes. Pickles all have dyes in them except like this one brand of pickles at Trader Joe's. So I will like go, if you start reading the labels, they all have dyes. And I try to find I'm like, I just want to give my kids pickles without dyes. I know, in the Gatorade and all this stuff. I mean, it's just, why are they putting it in there? I don't care if my Gatorade's red. Like, who made those decisions, right? I mean, it's some
Right.
marketing thing. Oh,
Right.
I don't
it
care if
makes
my pickle is extra green.
no.
Fine with it.
Right. Yeah.
Stop giving us dyes. We don't want it. It's like you don't even realize. Yeah, you didn't realize that you were making a choice. They're just
Right. Right.
uh,
I I hurt my leg. This was like a couple of years ago. And my doctor prescribed me this medication. I can't remember the name of it, but because I just kept it. And so when I was, like the package did not reveal some things about the medication. And so if I'm prescribed something, I really don't take medication, but in the off chances that I am like extremely in pain, I will. And so this prescription, I had looked it up, and there was this regulatory unit had put out some information saying, do not take this medication, and listed all of these reasons. And so on my next doctor's visit, I took that information that I found, and he apologized, and he said he didn't know. And so he said he was going to stop prescribing that medication. But I was like, oh my God, just like, what if I hadn't looked it up?
Good
yeah,
that you did.
yeah, yeah. It seems like we have to be advocates for ourselves and then share like that, like you
Right.
did. So now
Mhm.
others will benefit from that. But that's
Because you
hard.
think about it, some of these doctors, like I have friends who are in pharmaceutical sales. And some of these salespeople, they don't even know what's in the medication, but their job is to sell it to a doctor. And the doctor, if somebody pitches something so well, sometimes they just try it without even fully understanding, the full ramifications of that medication. So I don't know.
Yeah, indeed. All of this discussion, right? Like, I'm so excited about the subsequent chapters that we have coming up. Next time, we're going to talk about the circulatory system and the digestive system. And, so we're going to dig deeper and continue to explore the science. There's a lot of science here, but also a lot of history. And I really love how it all comes together in this text. So we're so excited, like, to continue reading this and to continue bringing this to you. Our next session is going to be March 19th. And so go ahead and reserve that in your calendars. Really hope to see you all back. Any closing comments or closing thoughts? We have about 4 minutes before folks want to give people time for a bio break and running your next meeting or whatever you got going on.
Will we get a meeting invite or something for the 19th or? Just,
Yes, we will
Okay.
send out another announcement and meeting invite.
okay, thank
And
you.
it's on the calendar, the institution's calendar too. You can register, but we'll make sure to send it to you, Trina.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All righty. Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy your afternoon. Look forward to
Thank
seeing
you.
you again on the 19th, if not before.
Okay, thank you. Have a good one, everybody.
All right. Take care.